My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Executive Director of FASB, the Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, which is co-sponsored by the Museum of Jewish Heritage in conjunction with the exhibition Operation Finale, the Capture and Trial of Adolf Eichmann, which I should say is closing this coming Sunday. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, I hope you will take the last few days as an opportunity. But the talk is also co-sponsored with FASB. FASB is particularly pleased to work with the museum on this program because it brings us, FASB, back to where we started. For those of you who don't know much about FASB, I think you have a copy of our journal and can find some information about us there. We were established in 2009 under the auspices of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And at the time, and still, our programs focus on graduate students and in professional degree programs, and that draw on the history of the Holocaust to drive home the importance of thinking about professional ethics today. From 2009 until 2017, FASB's offices were in this building, January of 2017, where we grew to run 5 programs in 5 separate fields, working with students in business, journalism, law, medicine, and future clergy. We continue to operate all 5 of those programs now as an independent nonprofit housed up in Times Square. And our fellows spend 2 intensive weeks in Germany and Poland visiting Auschwitz and other historical sites and participating in rigorous seminars led by experts in the field. And our fellows begin their studies by examining the actions of their professional counterparts in Nazi-controlled Europe, and then draw on that history to explore the ethical issues facing their fields today. In short, our program seeks to bridge the history and the present. One thing I should emphasize also about FASB, and you may get this from the journal you're holding, is that we focus largely on the perpetrators, asking questions about how and why professionals in Germany abandoned their ethical guideposts to either actively support or tacitly accept Nazi policies. We also ask what that should make us think about today about the decisions we make on an everyday basis in our professional lives. This interest in understanding the perpetrators, of course, leads into tonight's talk by David Luban, who will talk about Eichmann and also several other perpetrators. The title of his talk, The Power of Bureaucrats from Adolf Eichmann to the Present, also suggests, I think, that he's going to be bridging that history to the present. I should mention also that although I think on the schedule it might appear that David Luban's going to speak for an hour and a half, that's not the way it's going to go. He's only going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. David Luban may be well known to many of you as one of the country's leading legal ethics scholars. I'm honored to say that he's a member of FASB's academic committee and has served as a faculty member for the FASB Law program. His day job, however, is being a university professor and professor of law and philosophy at Georgetown University. His research interests center on moral and legal responsibility in organizational settings, including law firms, the government, and the military. In addition to legal ethics, he also writes on the just war theory, national security, and international and criminal law. His most recent book, Torture, Power, and Law, which is available in the museum bookstore, won the American Publishers Association's Prose Award for professional and scholarly excellence in philosophy. One legal scholar at Columbia University, I think, captured much of the importance of his work, saying, if there is but one book to pick from the U.S. political crisis, if there is but one book to pick for the U.S. political crisis over the use of torture, then clearly it's David Luban's. I will not run through the title and accolades that he's won for the other 10 books that he's published or for the more than 180 articles that he's published, but I encourage you to start working through his publication list. I could go on talking more about David Luban's many other accolades, but let me add something that's not often noted about him in his bio, and that is that David Luban is also a scholar of history. He has cultivated a particular interest in Hannah Arendt and Adolf Eichmann, among other subjects, which leaves me eager to hear his talk. So without further ado, please welcome Professor David Luban.
thank you for that really kind introduction. One of the most moving and powerful experiences that I've had, I should say, is having the privilege of co-leading the group of law fellows at FASB, along with Judith Lichtenberg, who is my wife and is a philosophy professor at Georgetown, a couple of summers ago, and traveling with this group of extremely talented professional students, talented and thoughtful, and I think morally aware professional students. And at each point on this infamous historical trail, asking, what role did the professions play in constructing the Holocaust? And how do you recognize these professionals in yourself, if you can? How can we learn about the professional ethics problems that face the various professions in the here and now? I mean, what is there that we could possibly learn from that time? And I want to start by relating a moment near the beginning of the Third Reich. It was April of 1933. And the new Hitler regime had passed a law that expelled all of the lawyers, all of the Jewish lawyers and judges and civil servants from their professions. And at that time, there was a meeting of the board of directors of the German Bar Association, which was the counterpart, it still exists today, was the counterpart of, let's say, the American Bar Association or the City Bar of New York. That is, an association of lawyers, not part of the government, really a private organization representing the legal profession. And they had a meeting to talk about, well, what should we do now that all the Jewish lawyers are kicked out? And they, perhaps unsurprisingly, voted that they were expelling all of the Jewish members as well. Now, I'm going to imagine what that meeting might have looked like. Probably sitting around the table were some German lawyers who were ideological Nazis and completely supported the government's law. But I also want to imagine that there were some who were good, conscientious lawyers, anti-Nazis, or at least neutral about what their new government might bring, wary, suspicious, whose attitude is, this is just terrible, what's been happening to our Jewish colleagues, that they're all expelled, who nevertheless ended up voting to expel the Jewish lawyers as well. And I could imagine what they were saying. Look, I would have opposed this law, but under this law, they're not lawyers any longer, so how could they possibly be part of the Bar Association if they aren't even members of the bar? And I could imagine some others saying, if we stand up against the new government, then imagine how that might destroy the German Bar Association as a credible organization. We might even be, under the conditions of that time, endangering ourselves. One interesting fact is that there were a number of Jewish members on that board of directors of the German Bar Association, and they abstained from the vote on the grounds that they had a conflict of interest. An amazing case of, I want to say, bad political judgment, bad moral judgment. Obviously, they thought that there was still some sense of decency and normality around them, and they got that wrong. And I think that the other lawyers, the ones in my hypothetical meeting, maybe thought, this is a bad situation, but we have to make the best of the bad situation. We have to keep on practicing law. We are the rule of law people that are left in the Reich. Maybe they thought we have to continue to uphold our profession and the profession's interests in the face of the new government. We can't be too oppositional and so on. Now, in that case, I want to say they too have had a catastrophic failure of moral judgment because they don't understand, or they didn't understand, how the camel, so to speak, was getting its nose under the tent. Hannah Arendt, who's a German American Jewish political philosopher, wrote a rather bitter essay near the end of her life, in which she reminisced about what she saw as the total moral collapse of respectable Germany during the early years of the Third Reich. And she said it wasn't a loss of responsibility, it was a loss of moral judgment. And the point that had happened was early on in the regime, when the Nazis began a policy called coordination, in which the party would get its tentacles into every organization of civil society. So imagine that you are an enthusiastic chess amateur, and you play in a chess club, and now the party tells the chess club, you've got to have a party apparatchik at the helm of the chess club or on the board of directors. And by the way, you can't have Jewish members any longer, and you have to decide, do I want to keep playing chess in a chess club where my Jewish friends are being expelled? And how about the chorus that I sing in my glee club? Do I want to quit the glee club as well? Or if you are a civil servant in a government organization, the Ministry of Interior, for example, do you think, well, the fact that all of my Jewish colleagues were just expelled last week, what do I do? And the failure of moral judgment that Hannah Arendt was talking about was the fact that they thought, we can keep going. We can keep going in this regime. And didn't understand that by doing that, they were normalizing and stabilizing the world around them as the moral world turned upside down. Now, that's the kind of phenomenon. I'm talking about the legal profession because as a law professor, it's the one that I know the most about. But you could imagine this in civil society, in each of the professions, the same kind of moral dilemmas coming up. And the fact is that many people went along without recognizing that they were even facing a moral dilemma yet. And when they finally realized it, it was already too late. Now, that's the kind of issue that at FASB we found ourselves wrestling with. If you are in an organization, a professional organization, and something that looks like the tip of an incipient moral crisis emerges, what do you do? How do you keep going? The term I want to use is the term moral compass. I should mention that I work one day a week at the United States Naval Academy's Ethics Center, and we talk a lot about moral compass because that's one of the enduring metaphors that naval officers can relate to. And in fact, every visiting speaker gets a little brass moral compass as a kind of gift from the academy. And if you think about the metaphor of a moral compass, the idea is that you actually know which way, it helps you know which way is north. And how do you keep your moral compass intact? Those are the kinds of questions that we were wrestling with. Now, you might say, well, what does this have to do with Adolf Eichmann? Adolf Eichmann was not a member of one of the learned professions. Adolf Eichmann was a high school dropout who had been a traveling salesman in Austria and had drifted into Germany, joined the Nazi Party. One of the things that was news to me was seeing his party ID card in the exhibit upstairs and noticing that his party membership number was about 900,000. So he wasn't an early Nazi enthusiast. It was already a sizable political force by the time he joined the party. And of course, he ends up as one of the other things that Hannah Arendt said about him, one of the greatest criminals of the period. For those of you who have not studied the career of Eichmann and maybe have not had a chance to visit the exhibit yet, his job was supervising, running the entire program of the deportation, the rounding up and shipping of Jews to the death camps during the period of the final solution. During the periods before that, he was also a deportation and expulsion expert, what we would today call ethnic cleansing. So think of him as the logistics guy for ethnic cleansing written large. So he was another phrase that Hannah Arendt uses, an enemy of all mankind in objective fact. He was not a petty bureaucrat. He was the equivalent of a senior executive. Not at the top level. His military rank in the SS never got higher than lieutenant colonel, and he was more or less 5 steps down the chain of command from Hitler in the killing apparatus. So think of him as an executive vice president in charge of logistics of an enormous and lethal operation. Now, Hannah Arendt was assigned by the New Yorker magazine to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann and wrote a series of articles that was published as her most famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, with a subtitle, A Report on the Banality of Evil. And this is a book that was controversial for many grounds, which I don't really want to talk about during the main part of this talk, although I'm perfectly happy in the discussion to explain more about what the controversies were. But one of her most explosive claims was when you read Eichmann's interrogation reports, when you hear his testimony, what you see is something that you wouldn't expect. You expect from one of the great criminals, from a hostis generis humani, an enemy of all mankind, is an ancient formula that, among other things, was one of the medieval names for Satan in Christian demonology. You expect Satan, and you find instead somebody, she thought, whose motivations were not ideological, or not primarily ideological, although, of course, being in the SS, he imbibed a lot of the ideology and parroted it back with enthusiasm. You didn't find a sadist, you didn't find a fanatic, you didn't find a monster, you didn't find Satan. What you found was somebody who was driven by a powerful sense of careerism. He was somebody who, when he got into the SS, into these positions, he discovered that he actually had talents, and the talents were talents at negotiation and at organization and at bureaucratic infighting, and had you might call a stellar career, exercising those talents. So a careerist, somebody with a certain amount of vanity, somebody who liked the exercise of power, but maybe not to a degree that was any different than anybody else who exercises power over, over helpless people. He was, Hannah Arendt said, banal in the sense that you don't see Iago, you don't see Richard III, you don't see any of the storybook villains whose motives seem to be incomprehensible evil. What you see is a moral schmendrick, a nothing. The term that always comes to mind when I think of her account of Eichmann is a moral chameleon. Set him down in a setting of ideological Nazis, and he sounds like an ideological Nazi. Take him to Jerusalem, and he says, I will gladly hang myself in public as a lesson to all the anti-Semites in the world. And Hannah Arendt thought, he says these things because reciting big, pathetic, kind of kitschy slogans gives him an emotional lift. It gives him this feeling of elation. And whatever the moral climate he's in, he'll take on that coloration. And that's the banality of evil. Now, of course, the term banality of evil has become part of our stock vocabulary that's used to describe many phenomena, and the phenomena are always more or less the same. Somebody who is an organization man and seems to be mindlessly executing the program of the organization. Now, there are a number of distinguished historians who in the last 20 years have said that Hannah Arendt got Eichmann completely wrong, that subsequent documents that have emerged show that he really was just the rabidly ideological anti-Semite that you might have thought that he was. And I don't really want to talk about that historian's controversy right now. I'm happy to answer questions about it later, but I think that actually Hannah Arendt was onto something really important about Eichmann. And if not Eichmann, we can think of many other people who might satisfy, the conditions of banality of evil that she lays out. No particularly monstrous motives, ordinary motives of career advancement, of doing a good job, of playing by the rules. And those are the people that I'm really interested in talking about and thinking about. Now, I also want to mention one caution. There's something called Godwin's Law that some of you might be familiar with. It's a kind of semi-joke on the internet. And Godwin's original proposal was that in any debate on the internet, in a finite amount of time, somebody's going to say, oh, that's just like Hitler or the Nazis. And then his rule is, that ends the debate, you lose. That anybody who uses Nazi analogies to describe something other than Nazis and Nazism has violated Godwin's Law, and they should automatically just shut up, stop talking. I'm not going to do that. But the caution is this, when we draw analogies between the professionals who participated in the Holocaust, and especially if we think about somebody like Adolf Eichmann, there is no pretense here that we're drawing moral equivalences. There is no moral equivalence between Dr. Mengele and, let's say, an unscrupulous physician in an HMO in the United States. There is no moral analogy between, let's say, the current scandal that is embroiling the Navy, the Fat Leonard scandal, which is a kickback and corruption scandal that's embroiled about 60 admirals under investigation from the 7th Fleet, and war crimes. I mean, those kinds of moral equivalences are insulting and demeaning and exaggerated and kind of not, as Godwin's Law suggests, they're frivolous, and they also run a profound risk of trivializing the Holocaust. So any analogy that's being drawn here is not an analogy of moral equivalence of any kind. It's rather the question of what gets ordinary people, like those non-anti-Semitic lawyers who were sitting around the table in the German Bar Association, to lose their moral judgment so seriously. So if we want to frame it in terms of the moral compass, there's a social scientific question. How is it that people in organizations, but in larger society, lose their moral compass, or can lose it swiftly and thoroughly? I should say parenthetically that Hannah Arendt said the fact that the Germans' moral compass went back into proper alignment so swiftly after the war is not much more reassuring, because it seems to show that our moral compasses are not very firm at all. So that's a first question. A second is the one that our professional students were embroiled with as a young person entering into a respectable profession, but knowing that I'm working in organizations that sometimes run off the rails. How do I keep my own moral compass pointing north when the moral compasses of the people around me seem to be pointing east. And then finally, a question that has been preoccupying many of us, I think in the last year, which is, what do you do if you find yourself in an organization where you think the moral compass is wrong? What stance do you take at that point? So let's start thinking a little bit about what it's like to work in an organization and the special moral phenomena that make organizations what they are. I mean, if you think about what you might call 10 Commandments morality, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and so on, we're thinking about individual decision making. And when individuals make decisions, usually when we reach a moral crossroads, we recognize that we've reached a moral crossroads. We have some idea about what the options are. We have some information, and we think about it. Now, when you put an individual into a bureaucratic setting, that isn't always true. First of all, knowledge oftentimes is parceled out among different people in the organization so that you never feel that you're making your decision in full understanding of the facts. If it looks like something is morally askew, you might think, well, I only see a tiny part of the picture and I don't know what else is going on here. Secondly, there is just as knowledge is fragmented, responsibility is fragmented. In our FASB session, we talked about a business case of the last few years. That was General Motors' fiasco that cost the company close to $5 billion, about failed ignition switches that went on for 10 years and caused a number of deaths. There was a major report about why didn't GM do anything about it? And some of the witnesses in the report talked about meeting after meeting to discover it, in which people were giving what they called the GM salute. That's the GM salute. Yeah, we've got to do something about it. Not my job, not my responsibility. Now, those are ordinary phenomena within organizations and within bureaucracy. But I want to talk about some of the other special features of working in an organization that pose special problems for moral compass. One of them is the fact that you have loyalties to your coworkers and to your teammates. And I can't overemphasize the importance of that, because if it looks as though the organization is doing something wrong and you want to be the one who's standing up, doing something about it, then there's always this sense, well, wait a minute, is this going to harm the men and women that I'm working with? I mean, you show up in the organization and you meet talented people with who you like. There's always, in any kind of group activity, a big element of trust. I'm relying on these people to hold up their end. I'm relying on them to watch my back. Something that I found particularly striking when I talk with young officers to be in the U.S. Navy, and the times that I've talked to Army officers and Marines. What's your mission? Well, the first responsibility that I'll have as a junior officer is that I have to accomplish the mission. The second is the lives of a lot of other people are entrusted to me, and so my second major job is to bring them back home, safe and sound and alive. And as for other responsibilities, those get pushed down the line. Now, you can imagine where if something Blackheart scenario happens in the military, that an instinct of somebody who says, one of my crucial responsibilities is to have my colleagues' backs. The impulse to cover up or to minimize is extraordinary, and I think a lot of the ethics education in the military is about putting the honor of the military organization above that notion of loyalty. But that notion of loyalty is just crucial. Now, if we're not talking about situations in which people actually literally have the lives of their teammates in hand. They might have their livelihoods in hand. There was a famous legal ethics scandal of a few decades ago in which a law firm's largest client turned out to be crooks who were running a gigantic Ponzi scheme. And the law firm was trying to figure out what to do and kept on calling one legal ethics expert after another saying, well, you've got to make sure that you don't close deals, further crooked deals, but you also don't want to release client confidences. It's not a particularly edifying story, but the fact is that the firm kept on closing the deals until finally the whole scheme went so public that there was no way to do it any longer, and the law firm suffered a catastrophe. And one of the things that was clear was that the major partners in the law firm were worried about the livelihoods of the people that they were working with. I think in business as well, there's this sense that if I try to do something about an ethical problem that maybe we could conceal, then it's going to cost a lot of people jobs, and I owe them something. So I think that what's most insidious about this phenomenon is that we're not talking about a tremendous moral vice. We're talking about a complete perversion of a moral virtue, and that virtue is loyalty and trustworthiness and having your colleagues back, and how the organization itself can take that virtue and turn it into something that is devastating. Now, here's another problem with organizations, along with that problem of loyalty to your coworkers, and that is just getting sucked into an organizational culture. Many of you remember the Enron catastrophe of 2001, so it's now almost 20 years ago. Enron had an extremely toxic corporate culture. It was a culture in which colleagues were supposed to rate the qualifications of the other people in their own office, and at the end of the year, the bottom 10% were fired. So it was just a vicious, mean corporate culture. It's possible to get so acculturated to it that you don't realize that you are in a world where the norms have gone askew. And here I want you to think about how, as a neophyte starting a new job, you come in and are told by the people, you see something that's not quite right, a practice of backdating documents, for example, a practice of, say, padding out bills in the billing department of a hospital. And the people that you want to earn their respect say, oh, that's the way we do things around here. That's just the way that it's done. And you think, well, I don't want to be stubborn and stiff-necked and naive. I guess if that's the way that it's done, let me just see what's going on and I'll just watch. Now, this was something that Eichmann claimed was his own psychology at one of the most decisively horrible moments in the Nazi murder of the Jews, and that was the Wannsee Conference in 1942. Wannsee is a villa on a lake near Berlin. It's now a museum, and one of the stops in the FASB program is a morning spent at Wannsee talking with historians and working through historical documents. At the Wannsee Conference, Eichmann was there taking notes, and there were important people, VIPs of the Third Reich. The final solution, the murder of the Jews, had already been decided on, and this was to how are we going to implement it. And what Eichmann said at his trial was, my boss was nervous about what the reaction was going to be, but everybody just seemed so enthusiastic. And who was I to judge? I felt like Pontius Pilate. Okay? And that Pontius Pilate moment was the moment of the organization man who is looking up and looking around taking his moral bearings from the reaction of his betters. Now, one of the key insights about this is that looking up and looking around and taking cues from others is, philosophers from Aristotle on have said, the way in which we learn morality. So once again, what we're watching in this kind of phenomenon is the perversion of a moral virtue, which is absorbing the ethical norms from the culture that you're in and the organization you're in and turning it into a catastrophic vice. Now, Eichmann then reports that once this mission of killing had become his official mission, he said, I lost all my pleasure in my work. And it lasted, that was a feeling that lasted with him, Hannah Arendt reports rather acidly, for 4 weeks. She said it was very interesting to see how long it takes for the conscience of an ordinary human being to turn upside down, and now we have first-person testimony. It takes about that long. Now, one way to think about this is that this is a problem of you might call the problem of the new normal. If the banality of evil means anything at all, it means that when we should be asking the question, is this right or wrong? Instead, we ask the question, is this normal behavior? So when you get to that job and are told, well, this is the way that things are done around here. You know, we always round up the number of hours we're billing. We always charge the maximum market price for the medical services that we're providing. That's just the way that it's done around here. Then the banal evildoer is the one who shuts off his or her own faculties of moral deliberation and lets the compass needle be guided by the compass needles of the people around them, which happen to be pointing east rather than north. And then, as their compass needle swerves toward the east, their little magnetic field makes it even harder for the next person who comes in to keep their compass needle pointing north. This is a kind of very insidious problem of acculturation. Now, something that happened at the Eichmann trial that flabbergasted the judges, flabbergasted Hannah Arendt, was Eichmann saying, I've always tried to live my life by Kant's categorical imperative, what Kant called the moral law. And then, to almost everybody's astonishment, he recited the categorical imperative almost flawlessly. And one of the judges was just flabbergasted and, of course, horrified that one of the great moral thinkers and preachers of moral autonomy, Immanuel Kant, would be invoked by Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann said, well, I really believed in what we call Kant for the little man, for the household use of the little man. Now, in the Third Reich, one of their major theorists, a man named Hans Frank, an extremely sinister person who, whose own son decades later said, I don't believe in the death penalty for anybody except my father. Hans Frank had a categorical imperative for the Third Reich, which is act as if your will was the Führer's will. So instead of act as if your will was the will of a legislature that's legislating morality, it's this other person's will that substitutes for your own, and that's probably what Eichmann meant by the categorical imperative of the little man. Now think about how insidious this is. One of the features of being an upper-level executive in an organization is that you are not supposed to be simply somebody who mindlessly does the minimum that you are told. You're supposed to take initiative. You're supposed to, as the American corporate adage has it, obey orders in advance of their being given. And the Hitler biographers, have noticed that one of the phenomena in the Third Reich is that very often the people who are subordinate to Hitler, who was a little bit of a cipher sometimes, would come up with more and more radical proposals and try to outcompete each other because they were trying to anticipate what it was that the Fuhrer really wanted, and maybe actually in that way made things worse. So that in Eichmann's case, he, as a defense, kept saying, I was just a little cog in the machine, which was, objectively speaking, a complete lie. Hannah Arendt at one point said, well, then the right question is, and why did you choose to become a cog in the machine? But even then, it's not machine-like, it's not robot-like what he did. It was what an executive does who is trying to anticipate the boss's wishes and whims. And so it's completely compatible with being a major and terrifying active agent of, in Eichmann's case, destruction. Now, the last of the phenomena that I want to talk about is professional roles and role morality. In the professions, each profession has a kind of sense that there are moral duties that are specific to this role. For doctors, for lawyers, for clerics in a pastoral role, the duty of keeping confidences, even if the thing that you're keeping confidential might lead to damage to third parties, is a central part of role morality and creates some important ethical and moral tensions. But there's a way in which the role can completely absorb somebody. And here I want to illustrate this with a very famous social psychology experiment. Many of you may know about it or have seen films about it. This was the Stanford prison experiment, done almost 50 years ago at Stanford University. It was a study by a couple of experimental social psychologists about the behavior of prisoners and prison guards. Why is it that prison guards become brutal? Why is it that prisoners become docile, broken, depressed? So in this experiment, a fake prison was created in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford, and 20 male student volunteers were assigned at random into the roles of guards and prisoners and just placed into this prison. It was done with a certain amount of dramatic flair. Those who had drawn the lot to become prisoners, they'd arranged to actually have the Palo Alto police do them, the psychologists, a favor and come and arrest them from their houses, and they were immediately put in uniforms, those kind of embarrassing hospital gowns that always make you feel vulnerable because they're open behind. It was just to recreate that sense of vulnerability of a prisoner. And the guards were given very spiffy-looking Ray-Ban sunglasses so that they looked kind of like Cool Hand Luke or something. And the question was, how would they start behaving? Well, the psychologists had to stop their experiment a week before it was scheduled to stop because the prisoners were in such a state of psychological collapse and the guards had become so brutal. Now, maybe there is a certain kind of sadistic streak in the guards, but let me just mention one striking diary entry, a pair of diary entries from one of the student volunteers who was a guard. Before the experiment began, he said, I'm very nervous about this because I'm a pacifist and a nonviolent person, and I could never do anything to harm another human being. A few days later, his diary entry says, prisoner number 416 won't eat, and we won't have any of that kind of shit around here. I take him, I put him in the hole. That was their name for the little closet that was their solitary confinement cell. I take greasy sausages and ram them into his mouth. They just run down, they're dribbling down his chest. I can't believe that it's me doing this, and it just makes me hate him even more. So the role takes over, but it takes over with other people as well to make this prison experiment more naturalistic. A lawyer is called in to talk to the prisoners about their parole hearings. Now, suppose that you are a lawyer and you come in and you see a group of young men who are in a state of psychological collapse. Well, what do? You might think that the natural thing that you would do is say, you got to get out of here. This is really bad for you. Instead, they talked about their parole hearings. They brought in a minister. The minister also didn't say what should have been obvious. This isn't a prison. This is the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building, and you can walk out anytime you want. There are no legal consequences because you're not really a prisoner. But they didn't. They gave them pastoral counseling for prisoners. The parole hearing officer was a former prisoner, a released person who had done years and had been through parole hearings himself. He behaved like a parole officer. And the final moment is with the psychologists themselves. At one point, a rumor goes around that there's going to be a prison break. And Phil Zimbardo, who was the psychologist who was running this, said, he recollects afterwards, as a social psychologist, I should have thought, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we should be studying. Let's make sure that the video cameras are working right. Instead, he thought, oh my God, I've got a prison break on my hands. What am I going to do? He calls the Palo Alto police and says, could you come back and help me put down a prison break? And they basically tell him to get lost. And then his old graduate school roommate comes in and says, hey, Phil, I hear that you've got this really interesting experiment going on here, and just I'd like to know, what's the independent variable? And Zimbardo says, I have a prison break on my hands. And this liberal effete ding-dong comes in and starts asking me about what the independent variables are. Somehow, the role just took everybody over. Now, that's a powerful example. I should mention that Phil Zimbardo, the psychologist who performed this experiment, ended up as a defense witness for one of the army defendants after Abu Ghraib. His view is that the power of the situation is so great that should mitigate punishment. I mean, it's just, I should say, not a view that I share. It's, by the way, not a view that Hannah Arendt shared. One of the accusations about her was that by minimizing Eichmann's monstrosity, she was kind of excusing him. And it led one of her earlier reviewers to say, banality of evil, let's talk about the perversity of brilliance. But in fact, Arendt wanted the death penalty for Eichmann and didn't mitigate his responsibility at all. Now, at FASB, the Law Fellows did an exercise. Before the program began, that is, before we all went off to Berlin and Krakow and Auschwitz, they were given a set of real facts about the following situation. The Germans, when they took France, also took some of the British language isles off the coast of France, the Isle of Jersey, which had a common law system, English speaking, but it's now under Nazi occupation. And the Nazis put in one after another set of anti-Jewish regulations. And our fellows, the law students, young lawyers, are given a set of these regulations and documents and 2 case files about women who are desperately trying to get themselves declared not Jewish under the very complicated Nazi regulations. And we simply ask this, would you, before you come to Berlin, write a legal memo about this case? And we got the memo, so there were a couple of striking things about them. One of them was that every last student found that neither woman was Jewish, which was doing the women literally a life and death favor. And the legal materials are a group of conflicting regulations, just the kind of thing that lawyers like to play with. And you basically could reach any result you wanted. You could have honestly reached the opposite result, but none of them did. And in our discussion, they all said, well, it's because I wanted to do the right thing by these women. One question was that none of them addressed was, why am I doing this at all? So think once again about the Stanford prison experiment, where a lawyer comes in to talk to these prisoners, and instead of telling them, get out of here, instead just gives them lawyer talk about how to prepare for a parole hearing. I think that our fellows who are extremely good law students, they know they're given an assignment. You write to write a legal memo. It's always a hypothetical fact, sometimes based on real cases. You write a legal memo. My year, we had one student whose memo began, I resign, and then continued, but I know you've got some pedagogical reason for doing this, so I'm going to write the memo that I would have written if I hadn't resigned. But one of the questions is, did the role just take over? Why didn't you, in that position, resign? Now, lest this seem completely fanciful, of course there was some lawyer on the island of Jersey who did this. I want to mention the career of a German lawyer named Bernhard Lüsner. Lüsner was a lawyer in the Ministry of Interior, and at one point in his career, he was a lawyer who was at the Ministry of Interior's Jewish desk, that is the desk dealing with Jewish affairs. And he gets a call late one night saying, you must come to Nuremberg by tomorrow because the Fuhrer is making a major speech and he needs some legislation drawn up. And it's just the kind of thing that a young lawyer, here I'd like you to imagine somebody who is not in the Third Reich, a young lawyer in a government ministry who's told the nation's leader wants you to come and help out with the drafting of legislation in a 48-hour, don't get any sleep at all, 2 consecutive all-nighters fueled by Red Bull or whatever it is that we fuel ourselves with for all-nighters these days, and back and forth with the leader himself. Lüsner drafted the Nuremberg laws. Lüsner describes himself as somebody who had joined the Nazi Party, it's a little hard to believe, without really realizing that it was going to go after the Jews. Probably he's lying about that. He probably isn't lying when he said that he was appalled at the extent and swiftness of the persecution. And he said, I wanted to stay on the job. The reason that I wanted to stay on the job is that I thought that I could save some lives. And the way that I would save lives is by the way in which I drafted the Nuremberg laws. The party radicals who were down the hall wanted anybody who had a drop of Jewish blood to be declared a Jew. I should mention that there's some historical evidence that the Hitler regime looked at US Jim Crow laws as models for their own anti-Jewish legislation. And Lüsner said, no, I'm going to fight this one drop of blood rule, and instead I will try my damnedest to make sure that the only people that this law applies to have 3 Jewish grandparents, and that will save many people. Now, my own view is that this is just an epic case of false consciousness. The idea that we have the man who actually drafts the Nuremberg laws describing himself as if he were a heroic rescuer. seems to me to be a complete disconnect with reality. But it may very well be that he did save lives, just as our fellows in their imaginary legal memo were saving two women who wouldn't necessarily have been saved if they had resigned their positions. Now, Hannah Arendt wrote about this as well, and she said you can't be under any illusions. Obedience, staying in your job, is support for the regime, and when you are trafficking in lesser evils, you can't forget that you are trafficking in evils. Now, I don't know whether to me this is a conundrum. I don't know if I think she was right. I think that it is possible for people to stay on the job in order to mitigate. And I'll give one other example from that period. There was another German lawyer, a man named Helmut James Moltke. Now Moltke, you might, those of you who are World War II buffs or history buffs might recognize the name. He was a descendant of one of the most famous German generals. Moltke was in the foreign ministry, and he was a very devout Christian. He was completely anti-Nazi, and eventually he was one of the July 20th bomb plotters who tried to kill Hitler in 1944, and he was tried in front of the very infamous fanatical Nazi jurist and executed in the most barbaric way. And there's a very moving book of his letters to his wife, in which the whole book is the life of a busy government official, a bureaucrat, who is using every trick at his disposal to try to save Jewish lives. And at the end, he says, when I stood up before Judge Freisler, said I was the one that he didn't make cruel jokes about. He recognized who I was, and he said, you're like us in just one way. Your God asks for the whole man. We ask for the whole man. Which way do you go? Do you give your all to Adolf Hitler? And Moltke writes to his wife that almost as if this was a moment of truth for him in which he could finally stand up, knowing that he was going to die, and speak the truth. Now, he stayed in that ministry. And I can't say that we should condemn him for having stayed in that ministry, even though all of the things that I've said before are true, that staying in normalizes the functioning of the regime. Having a very good man like Moltke stay in normalizes it probably even more stringently, because people who are thinking about quitting look at him and say, if somebody who's a good man like this stays in, then it can't be so bad for me to stay in. Now, I'm going to wind up by trying to, once again, no moral equivalences, but to talk about a current dilemma that my students and colleagues, people that I know, have confronted. After the last election, I wrote a piece that was called "The Case Against Serving" in the Trump administration, and I was imagining what it would be for somebody who didn't share the Trumpian values, and I meant conservatives as well as liberals, and maybe even more conservatives, because I think for liberals the idea of whether to serve or not in an administration that's completely antithetical to them is more clear-cut. Well, that's not a job that I'm looking for. But how about the conscientious conservatives? What should they do? And I laid out the case that I've laid out tonight against serving, that it normalizes, that you yourself will find yourself being compromised again and again and again. I don't know whether that was the right thing. I should say that my wife told me that I was absolutely wrong, that it was really important for everybody who was conscientious to stay in and to, so to speak, become the deep state, become those who are in the bureaucracy that are going to stop the excesses that many of us feared would come to pass in the election. I had students who were coming to my office and saying, I've been offered my dream job in the Justice Department. I don't know whether I could take it or not. One of them, I should say, said something that I loved. Said, I've been wrestling with this. I sent your article to my brother, and my brother wrote back and said, I think you're a better person than Hannah Arendt thinks you are, which I thought was a great comeback. And one of them said, I would be relocating my family from my New York City law practice, which I like, to Washington. And my wife told me that she would do it if this was really my dream job. But if it wasn't my dream job, if it was a job where I felt shamefaced when I got up in court and said, Your Honor, I represent the United States government, I said, I'm not going to dislocate my family so that you can do that. Now, what are the choices for somebody who finds themselves in that position? It seems to me that one of them, I mean, not for somebody who's already in the job, one of them is to quit. One of them is to stay. But if you stay, then do you go along with the parts that really morally rankle? Or do you stay in order to sabotage that program? Let me be specific about what that might entail. An issue that I care about very passionately is mass incarceration in the United States. And I've been an enthusiastic supporter of the Eric Holder Justice Department's grant of prosecutorial discretion to U.S. prosecutors, saying that you should really look at the seriousness of offense, of course, but also look at the situation of the offenders and whether there would be very harsh mandatory minimum sentences. And the new Attorney General comes in and says, I am instructing all federal prosecutors to prosecute the maximum that the law will permit in every case. Now, for somebody who shares my views about mass incarceration, which I'm not going to assume that all of you share, but let's just play along with this for the moment, that would be the moment at which I couldn't do my job any longer if I were a prosecutor. If I had to take cases of nonviolent offenders who've run afoul of some drug law that has a horrific mandatory minimum, where if I was exercising my discretion in the way that professional standards say I should, I would not go forward with this case. If I now have to prosecute it to the maximum, I would have two choices. I could quit, or if I stayed, I would have to find some way to sabotage that rule, to work around it and make sure that I wasn't doing that. And the moral dilemma that professional faces is, do I want to be in a job where I see my role as sabotaging the mission? That, it seems to me, runs very strongly afoul of all the norms of professionalism that we face. So I think that this is just a genuine moral dilemma. It's the kind of thing that I would actually welcome to your thoughts about. I would also, and at this point, I just want to wrap up and open this up for your questions and your comments, and above all, Socratic discussion. Thank you.
If I may, I'd like to jump immediately to your question at the end. Recently, there were articles a senior State Department official who resigned, wrote, "This is what he's doing. He's hollowing out the State Department." I'm talking about this person in the White House. Why is he, and Rachel Maddow was talking about, why is he doing this? And I know the answer. I'm thinking back to the days when Reagan was coming to office and saying, we gotta deregulate. We gotta clear house. We gotta make out. We gotta clear things up. Life is too complicated. We need fewer attorneys. After 8 years, what had happened was, there was a moment when we were saying, we've cleaned up enough house. There are things we gotta do. We gotta clear up the lawyers. We gotta get this job done. When Reagan left, there were more lawyers working in Washington than there had ever been. But they were no longer the liberal Jewish gay Democrats from the Northeast. But the right wing, and I'm not gonna call them conservative, Republicans from the Midwest, also, we're not going to even talk about their orientation. But they were there, and they were taking full force and pushing this agenda, and they were there for a generation. This right now, the president is is wrecking the deep state, cursing the deep state, but he's pushing people out who are of good conscience and feeling ethically constrained. I can't do this. He's pushing them out, and eventually the hallways are going to be empty, and he's going to pull in people who do not have this moral compass, who are saying, you know, I'm not going to fight this. In fact, I agree with this. And that's the problem that we got to face. They are looking for the people who are going to say, I can't do this, I can't stand this. And we're going to be stuck with these sons of bitches for a generation. That's the problem. No.
Okay. I think you've made a powerful argument for saying that if that's what somebody does, then the second question is, go along with the newly defined department mission or stay and sabotage. And I think that's the second set of issues. I mean, let's give Bernard Loesner the benefit of the doubt for the moment and take him at face value. He said, you may think that I'm a monster because I've been drafting the Nuremberg laws, but in fact I was doing it in such a way as to save the maximum number of lives possible. Possibly that's true. Very few officials are in the position to do that. What they're in the position to do maybe is to argue in a closed meeting about a change of policy. But otherwise, they have to execute the job or sabotage the job. And I think that's the second, and to me, almost harder question than stay or quit. I mean, quitting might just be a personal decision. I just can't hang on any longer in this environment. And I take your point that maybe some hanging on was exactly what was called for.
We're going to ask that it's questions only.
I have an actual question. With respect to your opening remarks about how after the Third Reich was established, the Jews were expelled from just about everything, and you pointed out, for example, the bar associations ratified that. To what extent do you think the violence and the ruthlessness that was already established by then of the Nazis engendered fear of resistance to these laws? Would it have been reasonable for a person to fear if they opposed the Nazi regulations that some serious ramifications would fall upon them?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a really good question. And I think that at that stage, and even at many later stages, the answer was no, if by ramifications you mean being thrown in a concentration camp. Yes, if what you mean is watching your career get stalled. Even somebody who is involved in the murder of the Jews could have said no without being physically punished, but their career would have been over. Eichmann could have refused to carry out his duties, and even though he was carrying state secrets, he wouldn't have been in any physical jeopardy. He just would have been returned to that which he didn't want, which is being, instead of a major executive, being a traveling salesman. Yes, sir. Yeah.
We're over here at the microphone.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry.
Hi, I wonder, thank you very much for a very compelling presentation. I'm wondering if there's any data that indicates, if when people sort of move into this sort of tunnel and don't look beyond a kind of very narrow perspective and value, if there's any evidence or data on effective ways of getting people to actually, for that myopia to break down. For example, they talk about people are much better financial planners and better planning for the future if they imagine themselves. They literally conceptualize themselves in the future and their future selves. And they're also, more, they talk about different points of view people have when they imagine themselves voting in the future, if they actually envision themselves in the room, whether they do it in the first person or the third person. I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking about like the Senate. Can we get, is there any data you're familiar with that actually gets people to sort of not be so focused on their narrow personal interests, but can, gets them to sort of break into a different way frame of viewing it?
Yeah. I think that there is an enormous amount of social psychology, very little of which I actually know. And I think that I know that there's at least one social psychologist in this audience who knows more than I do, but that studied the question of how do you, if there's subconscious forces, like whatever it was that turns the Stanford prison experiment student from a pacifist to a sadist in 4 days, about how you break those spells. I think that the most significant that I've seen is that it doesn't take an enormous number of people who resist the spell to make the spell go away for others as well. That is, if there are 2 or 3 or 4 conscientious resistors in the office, does the spell set in? If there were a couple of those prison guards who said, wait, this is completely mad what we're doing, and you just have to dial all of this back dramatically, that can make the spell break, but that doesn't answer the question that I think you were asking, first about data, but second, how can I guard myself against that disastrous loss of moral compass? Here, I just have common sense suggestions. One of them is that at the start of a job, you have, so to speak, your own red line. If I'm asked to do this, this is the moment that I quit. And you write it down and you put it in your drawer and you think about it. And you can draw the red line where you want. I mean, I know my red line would always be, if this is something that I would have been ashamed to tell my parents about, then that's the time that I would quit. And I have a very high regard for the moral compass of my parents. There was a wonderful memoir by a young New York City DA who said that his red line was always prosecuting a case in which he didn't actually believe that the defendant was guilty. And at one point in his career, he found himself doing that. But a few months later, he realized that he'd crossed his red line and left. I think a second that emerges from a great deal of social psychology research is that one of the ways in which we manage to inure ourselves to the harm that we're doing is with the GM salute. It's not my fault. It's somebody else's. In the famous Milgram electric shock experiments, the subjects afterwards were asked to apportion blame between themselves, the person who's pushing the button and giving the electric shocks, the experimenter who's saying you must continue, the experiment requires you to do this, and third, the victim who just keeps on answering questions wrong. And almost all the people who complied allocated most of the responsibility to the other two. So my tip is, if you find yourself blaming the people around you when things are not going the right way morally, that's a danger sign. Okay. Yeah.
The one you called on over here was where?
Okay.
Thank you for a very, very fine presentation. At the end, you mentioned the mass incarceration, that you're opposed to it. Apparently, it became law sometime in the 1990s when President Clinton went forward with those rules. But as far as incarcerating people today, you said especially drug cases. What do you do with someone who sells drugs in a school? Goes to a school district, you say, okay, we can't incarcerate these people, it's unfair, they didn't do anything violent. So if each person decides, well, that person is okay, that person isn't, then we have chaos. So it seems to me there should be some road, a path to follow for judges to prosecute the law. Otherwise, there's chaos. So how do you feel about that? You said, don't lock up, I think you said, don't lock up these drug dealers or drug offenses. But that is problematical.
Yeah.
So if you could explain.
Yeah. Prosecutors in our system have an enormous amount of discretion about which cases to bring and which cases not to. There's a very interesting best practices manual that the ABA put out for prosecutors that sets out factors to think about. And those factors might be, how much harm did the person do? How much of a threat do you think they're posing in the future? What would be the collateral damage that was done to other people around them in their community? How about third parties? 8 or 9 factors, which some of them look beyond the nature of the offense itself to the effects that locking up a lot of people from the same inner city community might have on the community. What are the experts call the collateral consequences of mass incarceration, which is sometimes the hollowing out of communities as so many of the young men go into the criminal justice system, and to take those into account in exercising discretion. Now, to me, I think that the reason that the Sessions memo was a red line is that it's an attempt to take away prosecutorial discretion and say no matter what these other factors might indicate, you always prosecute every crime to the maximum that the law will allow. And oftentimes that means not a question of letting somebody go. Sometimes the prosecutorial discretion is in recommended sentence. Is it long or short? Whether to prosecute for a crime that carries a mandatory minimum or one that doesn't, that covers the same acts. And prosecutors have always exercised that kind of judgment. And it seems to me that that's the way in which prosecutors could make a difference without saying, well, I'm just never going to prosecute somebody who is dealing drugs in the schools. It might be that you decide which of several crimes you might prosecute them for and look at the circumstances.
So with that, we're going to close. We'd like to thank Professor Luban for joining us and FASB for co-sponsoring tonight.